It is the year 1340. Outside, the sun has long since vanished, leaving behind a world of absolute, bone-chilling white. In this era, there are no switches to flip, no thermostats to turn. There is only the rhythmic crackle of the hearth and the heavy silence of the great freeze. For the villagers huddling beneath layers of coarse wool and dry straw, winter isn't just a season, it is an endurance test. It is a time when the world shrinks to the size of a single room, shared with the livestock for warmth. As the snow piles up against the door, locking you in 4 months, tonight we aren't looking for the glory of kings or the chaos of battles. We are looking at the quiet struggle of the ordinary, the smell of wood smoke, the fear of a depleting grain store, and the crushing weight of the medieval night. Close your eyes. Forget the hum of the modern world. Let the fire burn low, and let us experience what it truly meant to survive the loneliest months in history. Let me ask you something, and seriously try to picture this. You wake up in the morning, but the sun doesn't rise. Not because it's cloudy, not because of a storm, but because winter has shortened the day so much that light feels like a brief accident. In a medieval village, winter mornings often began in darkness and ended in darkness, with only a few weak hours of pale daylight in between. And when the sun disappeared, it didn't slowly fade like it does in modern cities. It vanished completely. In many medieval villages, once the sun set, the world became black in a way we can barely imagine today. No streetlights, no glowing windows everywhere. No distant cities lighting up the horizon. Just raw darkness. People didn't walk home at night casually. They memorized paths during the day, because at night even familiar roads could disappear under snow. There are records of villagers getting lost just a few meters from their own homes. During winter nights, darkness wasn't empty to them. It was something that swallowed you. What made this worse was how people understood darkness itself. Medieval villagers believed night was when danger woke up. Wolves hunted more boldly, thieves moved unseen, and beyond real threats, there was something even more frightening. People truly believed darkness was the domain of spirits, demons, and restless souls. Winter nights were longer, which meant evil, in their minds, had more time to roam. Sitting in the dark wasn't just uncomfortable. It felt unsafe, like inviting something unseen into your home. The cold, meanwhile, didn't politely stay outside. Medieval houses were not built to trap heat. Wood shrank in winter, opening gaps in walls and floors. Wind slipped through doors and roofs. Snow crept in wherever it could. Fires didn't heat rooms. They heated whoever sat close enough to them. When the fire weakened, the cold reclaimed the house almost immediately. Some winters were so severe that water froze indoors. Ink turned solid in ink, and bread became rock hard inside the home. This wasn't an outdoor survival challenge. This was daily life. Nighttime was the most dangerous part of all. Families slept close together, sometimes even with animals, not for comfort, but because shared body heat could mean the difference between life and death. People woke in the night to make sure children were still breathing. The elderly often didn't survive winter not because of illness, but because the cold simply overcame them in their sleep. There are historical records describing people found frozen indoors, wrapped in blankets, the fire long extinguished. Food made winter even crueler. By the time deep winter arrived, fresh food was gone. What you ate depended entirely on how well you prepared months earlier. Salted meat, dried peas, coarse black bread made from poor quality grain. When supplies ran low, people stretched meals in desperate ways. Grinding bark, roots, or anything that could fill the stomach, in particularly harsh winters. Families ate the very grain meant for planting in spring. That choice kept them alive for a few more weeks, but it often guaranteed famine later. Winter didn't just threaten the present, it quietly destroyed the future. And then there was the silence. Snow-absorbed sound, turning villages into unnaturally quiet places. No birds, no insects, fewer voices, just wind and the occasional crack of frozen wood. That silence weighed on people's minds. With no books for most villagers, no music, no distractions, fear grew easily. This is why winter became the season of stories, prayers, and superstition. Talking kept people sane. Religious rituals increased during winter not just for faith, but because they helped people survive psychologically. In the middle of all this darkness, one thing stood out more than anything else: a single glowing window. That warm yellow light wasn't just fire. It was proof of life. Someone inside still had fuel. Someone was still fighting winter. Villagers noticed which houses stayed dark for days. Those houses were feared. Darkness often meant death had already arrived, sometimes before anyone dared to check. When we imagine medieval villages today, covered in snow and looking peaceful, we're seeing them wrong. Winter was not beautiful to the people who lived through it. It was an enemy. Every night survived was a victory. Every sunrise felt like mercy. And when spring finally came, it wasn't welcomed casually. It was celebrated like a miracle, because surviving winter meant you had beaten something that truly tried to erase you. Let me tell you something that sounds simple, but in a medieval village, it could decide whether your entire family lived or died. Winter survival didn't begin when the snow fell. It began months earlier, when the sun was still warm and fields were still green. If you waited until the cold arrived, it was already too late. And the terrifying part is this: most people didn't know whether they had prepared enough until winter was already locking them in. Medieval villagers lived with a constant countdown in their heads. Summer wasn't just a season of growth, it was a race. Every day of warmth was borrowed time. People didn't think, what should we eat today? They thought, will this be enough when the world freezes? One miscalculation, one failed harvest, one spoiled barrel, one roof left unrepaired on, winter didn't forgive it. The first and most brutal preparation was food, because medieval villages didn't have backup systems. There were no emergency shipments, no refrigerated storage, no supermarkets quietly restocking overnight. What you had when winter arrived was everything you were going to get, and food preservation was risky. Meat had to be salted perfectly, or it rotted. Grain had to be kept dry, or mold destroyed it. Vegetables had to be stored underground, where frost could still claim them if temperatures dropped too far. There are historical records describing entire villages, starving not because they had no food, but because the food they stored quietly failed while no one was looking. Here's a shocking thing people rarely talk about. Medieval villagers didn't know why food spoiled. They didn't understand bacteria or mold the way we do. When preserved food failed, it felt random, like bad luck, like punishment. Sometimes families opened barrels in deep winter only to discover their food had turned poisonous. Eating it meant sickness or death. Not eating it meant starvation. Imagine standing there, cold, hungry, surrounded by your family, knowing that every option in front of you could kill you. Firewood was just as critical, and this is where things get even darker. Villagers needed enormous amounts of wood to survive winter, but forests weren't endless, and cutting wood was exhausting, dangerous work. Axes broke, people got injured, and once snow fell, gathering more wood became nearly impossible. Families counted logs the way we count money. Every piece burned was one less for later. People intentionally let themselves shiver, even inside their homes, because wasting wood early could mean freezing in February. One shocking fact that rarely makes it into textbooks is this. Medieval families often rationed fire by deliberately allowing rooms to drop below freezing at night. They slept in layers, barely moving, because movement meant losing heat. Fires were sometimes only lit for cooking, then allowed to die. The house didn't feel like shelter. It felt like a compromise with death. Homes themselves had to be prepared, but medieval houses were fragile things. Roofs leaked, walls cracked, thatch had to be replaced constantly. If snow accumulated too heavily, roofs could collapse. There are accounts of entire families crushed. In their sleep when winter storms brought more weight than their homes could bear, repairing a roof in winter was nearly impossible, which meant mistakes made in autumn became fatal months later. Winter didn't just test people, it tested craftsmanship. Animals were another gamble. Livestock meant food, warmth, and survival, but they also consumed precious resources. Feeding animals through winter required stored fodder, and if supplies ran out, people faced impossible choices. Do you slaughter the animal early and lose long-term benefits? Or do you keep feeding it and risk starving your children? Some families brought animals inside their homes, not out of kindness, but because shared warmth increased survival odds. The smell was unbearable, the noise constant, but heat mattered more than comfort. Here's something deeply unsettling. In particularly harsh winters, medieval villages sometimes abandoned the weakest. Members of society not openly, not violently, but quietly. The elderly, the sick, those who couldn't contribute labor were given less food, fewer resources, and less warmth. This wasn't cruelty as they understood it. It was survival math. Winter forced people into decisions that would haunt them forever. Preparation wasn't only physical, it was psychological. Villagers mentally prepared themselves for loss. They expected death. They talked about it openly in autumn, not in whispers, but practically. Who would sleep where? Who would get priority near the fire? Who would eat first if supplies ran low? Winter planning included accepting that not everyone might make it through. And here's the most shocking part of all. Even when people did everything right, winter could still destroy them. A sudden freeze could kill crops before harvest. A storm could wipe out stored food. Disease spread faster in cold, cramped homes. Preparation increased your chances, but it never guaranteed survival. This is why medieval people believed so deeply in fate, God, and divine will. When so much was out of your control, belief wasn't optional. It was emotional armor. So when winter finally arrived, villagers didn't feel excitement. They felt dread mixed with grim readiness. Doors closed. Paths disappeared. The world shrank to the inside of a house and the inside of your mind. Every creak of wood, every howl of wind, every sudden silence carried meaning. Winter was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and now the question wasn't whether life would be comfortable, but whether it would continue at all. And the worst part, winter wasn't even at its peak yet. Okay, let's talk about something that sounds harmless to us today. But in a medieval village during winter, it was absolutely terrifying. Getting sick, not wounded, not stabbed, not starving. Just sick. A cough, a fever, a weakness you couldn't explain. In winter, that alone could quietly sign your death warrant. Here's the thing people often forget. Medieval villagers didn't fear disease only because it hurt. They feared it because winter removed every safety net that might help you recover. When the cold came, your body was already under attack. Malnutrition weakened you. Constant shivering burned calories you couldn't replace. Sleep was shallow and restless. Your immune system didn't stand a chance, even before illness arrived. Now imagine catching a cold in that condition. No antibiotics. No real medicine. No understanding of viruses or bacteria. People didn't know what made them sick. They only knew that sickness spread faster in winter, and once it entered a house, it rarely left quietly. One person coughing meant everyone watched them with dread, because illness didn't belong to individuals. It belonged to families. Winter homes made everything worse. Houses were small, sealed tightly against the cold, filled with smoke from fires that rarely vented properly. People breathed the same air for weeks. Windows stayed closed. Moisture froze on walls. Coughing echoed in cramped spaces. If one person got sick, everyone inhaled the same sickness. Medieval villagers didn't call this contagion. They just knew winter sickness traveled. Like a curse, here's a deeply unsettling fact. Historical records show that winter illnesses often killed more people than open warfare during the same period. Not dramatic plagues, just fevers, chest infections, and what we'd now call pneumonia. A simple fever could burn through a village silently, leaving people too weak to work, gather wood, or even feed themselves. Winter didn't need dramatic epidemics. It thrived on small weaknesses. Once someone fell ill, treatment was dangerous. Medieval medicine believed sickness came from imbalances in the body. Cold illnesses were treated with heat, herbs, bloodletting, or fasting. Yes, imagine being sick, freezing, and already half-starved, and being told that eating less would help you heal. For many, treatment weakened them faster than the illness itself. And then there was fear. Fear changed how people behaved in ways that feel uncomfortable to admit. Families isolated the sick, not out of cruelty, but because survival demanded it. Someone coughing too much might be moved farther from the fire. Someone feverish might be given less food until they recovered. In extreme cases, sick individuals were kept in separate rooms or barns, not because people wanted them gone, but because everyone else was terrified of becoming next. One shocking reality is this: winter sickness made people afraid of each other. Touch became dangerous. Sharing food became risky. Even compassion had limits when survival was on the line. Medieval communities valued togetherness, but winter tested that bond brutally. Love existed, but fear was louder. Children were especially vulnerable. Their bodies were smaller, weaker, and less resistant to cold and disease. Infant mortality spiked in winter. Many babies simply didn't survive their first cold season. Parents expected this possibility. It didn't make it easier. It just made grief a familiar companion. Winter wasn't just cold and dark, it was emotionally devastating. The elderly faced a similar fate. Weak lungs, brittle bones, and thin bodies made winter illness almost unavoidable. Many elders didn't die dramatically. They faded, a cough that never stopped, a fever that lingered, a body that finally gave up in the night. Medieval winter deaths often happened quietly, without witnesses, without struggle, just absence in the morning. Here's another shocking detail. People often didn't know who had died until daylight. Darkness hid death. Families woke to silence where breathing should have been. Winter mornings sometimes began with the realization that someone hadn't made it through the night. No warning, no goodbye. Just cold stillness. Religion became a coping mechanism here, not just belief. People prayed not only for healing, but for understanding. Why this child? Why this parent? Why this house? Winter sickness felt random, unfair, and deeply personal. Faith gave meaning to something that otherwise felt unbearable. And yet, despite all this fear, people couldn't stop living. Work still needed to be done. Fires still needed feeding. Animals still needed care. Sick or not, winter demanded effort. Many people worked until they collapsed, because resting meant falling behind, and falling behind meant death later. This is what makes medieval winter illness so horrifying. It didn't arrive alone. It arrived when bodies were weakest, resources lowest, and hope already thin. A simple cold wasn't simple. It was the final push over an edge people had been standing on for months. By the time winter sickness spread through a village, it wasn't just about health anymore. It was about endurance, about whether the human body and spirit could survive long enough to see the sun climb higher again. And for many, it couldn't. Let's be honest for a second. We like to believe that hard times bring out the best in people, courage, kindness, unity. And sometimes that's true. But winter in a medieval village often did the opposite. It stripped people down to something more raw, more desperate, and sometimes more frightening. Winter didn't just test bodies. It tested morality. When survival became uncertain, kindness quietly gained conditions. Help was given carefully. Compassion had limits, and choices people never imagined making suddenly felt logical. Not evil, logical. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval villagers lived in close-knit communities, but winter forced them to think in terms of who could survive and who couldn't. That question hovered over everything. Who eats first? Who gets the warmest spot near the fire? Who is worth saving if resources run low? And yes, those questions were asked. Not always out loud, but they were there. During winter, productivity mattered more than personality. A strong adult who could chop wood, haul water, or tend animals was more valuable than someone who couldn't contribute. Children were protected because they represented the future, but the elderly and chronically ill existed in a terrifying gray zone. Loved, respected, but also quietly feared as winter burdens. Here's a shocking historical reality. In some medieval communities, elders voluntarily reduced their own food intake during winter, believing it was their duty to preserve the younger generation. This wasn't always forced. Sometimes it was expected. Other times it was internalized. Winter didn't just kill people. It convinced them to step aside. Fear reshaped relationships inside the home too. Tempers were shorter, arguments sharper. Hunger and cold made small conflicts explode. Domestic violence increased during harsh winters, not because people suddenly became cruel, but because stress stripped away restraint. Medieval records mention winter months as times of increased family disputes, theft, and accusations. And speaking of accusations, this is where things turn even darker. Winter was the season of suspicion. When food vanished, when sickness spread, when animals died mysteriously, people looked for explanations. And when explanations didn't exist, they looked for someone to blame. Winter provided perfect conditions for paranoia. Long nights, exhaustion, fear, isolation. This is why accusations of witchcraft, curses, and evil influence often spiked during winter or immediately after it. Someone's cow died. Someone must be responsible. A child fell ill. Someone nearby must have caused it. Medieval people didn't see these thoughts as irrational. They saw them as survival instincts. If danger existed, it had to have a source. Here's a chilling fact. Many recorded witch accusations began not in moments of chaos, but during long, quiet winters, when people had nothing to do but think, remember, and resent. Winter didn't invent fear. It gave it time to grow. Even generosity changed shape. Helping others was risky. Giving food away meant less for your own family. Letting someone stay in your home meant sharing heat, air, and possibly disease. So charity became selective. People helped those they trusted, those they believed would survive anyway. The weakest often received the least. Not because they were hated, but because winter made people ruthless with logic. And yet, and this is important, people weren't monsters. They struggled with these choices. Guilt followed them. Shame lingered. Medieval writings, sermons, and personal accounts are filled with regret over winter decisions. People prayed not just for survival, but for forgiveness for what survival required. One of the most haunting aspects of medieval winter is how it normalized loss. Death became routine. Funerals were delayed because frozen ground couldn't be dug. Bodies were stored for weeks, sometimes inside buildings. Imagine living beside death, literally waiting for spring to bury it properly. That changes how you see life, how you value time, how you treat others. Children grew up fast in winter. They learned silence, patience, fear. They learned not to ask for food when supplies were low, not to cry loudly at night. Winter taught obedience harshly but effectively. Childhood innocence didn't survive many cold seasons. And then there was isolation. Snow cut villages off from each other. Roads disappeared. Travel became deadly. Once winter settled in, you were on your own. Help wasn't coming. Authority didn't matter. Laws felt distant. Survival rules replaced social ones. Winter didn't erase society, but it bent it. What makes this chapter of history so unsettling is not that people behaved badly. It's that their behavior makes sense. Put under the same conditions, cold, hunger, darkness, uncertainty, we might make similar choices. Winter forced people to prioritize survival over ideals, and that tension left scars that lasted long after the snow melted. By the time spring arrived, medieval villagers weren't just thinner. They were changed. Some relationships didn't recover. Some guilt never faded. Winter ended, but its consequences lingered in memory, in behavior, and in the quiet understanding that next year it would come again, and people would face the same impossible choices all over. All right, now imagine this part carefully, because this is where winter stopped being just a physical threat and became something psychological. Once deep winter settled in, medieval villagers didn't go outside. Less, they almost stopped going outside entirely. Snow buried paths, winds burned exposed skin, and darkness swallowed the day. Life collapsed inward, into a single room, a single fire, and the same faces, day after day. A medieval winter home was not spacious. Most families lived in one main room. Cooking, eating, sleeping, working, everything happened in that same space. There was no privacy, no quiet corner, no escape. When winter arrived, the house became both shelter and prison, and you couldn't leave it without risking your life. Here's something that sounds small but mattered enormously. People were bored, deeply, painfully bored. No books for most villagers, no music unless someone could sing or play an instrument. No games beyond simple storytelling, guessing, or religious recitation. When the sun set early, there was nothing to do but sit, talk, or think. And thinking too much in winter was dangerous. Shocking fact, medieval sources describe winter as a time when the mind wandered into darkness. People reported intrusive thoughts, fear of the night, and overwhelming anxiety. Today, we'd recognize this as severe seasonal depression. But back then, it was seen as spiritual weakness or temptation. People believed winter made the mind vulnerable to sin, doubt, and despair. The lack of light made everything worse. Candlelight was dim and expensive, so most people sat in shadow. Faces were half-lit. Movements were slow. Time felt distorted. Hours stretched endlessly. Days blurred together. Without clear daylight markers, people lost track of time easily. Some medieval writings mention villagers unsure whether it was early morning or late afternoon until they checked the sky. Being trapped together intensified emotions. Small irritations turned into serious conflicts. Someone breathing too loudly, someone taking too much space near the fire, someone speaking at the wrong moment. Winter amplified everything. Arguments that would have faded in summer lingered for weeks, because there was no distance to cool them down, and yet silence could be worse than noise. Long stretches passed where no one spoke. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against walls. Snow slid from roofs. That silence made people hyper-aware of every sound. Many villagers slept lightly, waking at every creak, convinced something or someone was outside. Wolves scratching at doors were not myths. They happened. Here's a disturbing reality. Confinement changed how people perceived reality. In winter, superstition thrived. Shadows looked like figures. Sounds became warnings. Dreams felt prophetic. With no external stimulation, the mind filled the gaps. This is one reason medieval winter folklore is filled with monsters, spirits, and omens. Fear needed a shape. Children suffered quietly in this environment. They couldn't run, they couldn't play freely. They were expected to be still, silent, and useful. Many learned adult responsibilities far too early, spinning thread, mending clothes, tending small fires. Winter didn't allow for childhood energy. It demanded control. Here's another shocking detail. Some medieval communities believed excessive laughter in winter was dangerous. Not inappropriate. Loud joy was thought to invite misfortune or anger, divine forces during a season already filled with suffering. Happiness became cautious, controlled. Even joy had rules. Nighttime confinement was the hardest. People went to sleep early, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. Sleep became a way to skip time, but sleep was shallow, broken by cold and hunger. Dreams were intense, often frightening. Many people believed winter dreams were messages or warnings. Waking up afraid was common. This mental strain is why winter was also a season of storytelling. Stories weren't just entertainment. They were survival tools. Stories filled time. They explained fear. They reminded people they weren't alone in their suffering. Religious stories reassured them that endurance had meaning. Without stories, winter felt endless. What's haunting is how familiar this sounds: isolation, darkness, repetition, anxiety. Medieval villagers experienced something we now associate with extreme confinement, but they endured it every single year. Winter didn't give breaks. It demanded patience, discipline, and mental resilience most of us never have to develop. By the time winter neared its end, people weren't just exhausted physically. Their minds were worn thin, tempers fragile, hopes cautious. Survival wasn't about strength anymore. It was about lasting just a little longer without breaking. And that's when winter delivered its cruelest twist, because just when people thought they'd adapted, winter wasn't done yet. This is the part of winter people rarely talk about, because it ruins the idea that survival is just about getting through the cold. In a medieval village, The deadliest time of winter wasn't the beginning. It wasn't the first snowfall. It wasn't even the darkest nights. The most dangerous moment came later, when winter had already drained almost everything people had. Late winter was when hope ran out before the cold did. By this point, villagers were exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally. They had been cold for months, hungry for weeks, afraid for so long that fear had become normal. Fires were weaker now. Woodpiles were smaller. Food stores were dangerously thin. And the cruel trick of late winter was this. It looked like it should be ending, but it wasn't. The days grew slightly longer, just enough to give people hope. And that hope was dangerous. Here's a shocking historical reality. Most medieval winter deaths happened after the worst cold had passed. People didn't die because of sudden storms. They died because their bodies were already spent. Malnutrition weakened them beyond recovery. Illness lingered too long. One cold night too many pushed them over the edge. Late winter food was the worst food. Salted meat had lost most of its nutrition. Grain stores were empty or moldy. Bread was made from whatever could be ground, even if it barely counted as food. People boiled scraps into thin soups and pretended it was enough. Hunger wasn't sharp anymore. It was dull, constant, and numbing. This is when people started making choices they swore they never would. Families reduced meals from 2 a day to 1, then to 1 shared pot, then to skipping days. Parents lied to children, telling them they had already eaten. Children learned not to ask. Hunger became a background noise. Like the wind outside always, there, never stopping. Here's something deeply disturbing. In late winter, medieval villagers often stopped planning for the future. Planting season felt abstract. Spring felt hypothetical. Survival narrowed to the next day, sometimes the next hour. When the future disappears from your thinking, risk-taking increases. People ventured out in dangerous conditions to forage, hunt, or steal. Many never came back. Late winter also changed how people viewed death. Early winter deaths shocked communities. Late winter deaths were expected. Mourned, yes, but not surprising. There are records of villages delaying funerals, not just because of frozen ground, but because death had become too frequent to process individually. Loss blurred together. Illness returned stronger in late winter. Bodies weakened by hunger couldn't fight infections anymore. A cough that might have been survivable earlier became fatal now. Fevers burned longer. Recovery slowed. People didn't get better, they faded. And here's one of the cruelest facts. Medical treatment became even harsher in late winter. Bloodletting, already dangerous, was still practiced on starving bodies. Herbal remedies ran out. People relied on prayers and rituals because nothing else remained. Faith didn't heal, but it gave structure to suffering. Late winter also brought a terrifying social shift. Theft increased. Not dramatic crimes, quiet ones. A missing loaf, a vanished chicken, a stolen log. Accusations followed. Trust eroded. Hunger made neighbors suspicious. Communities that survived together for months began to fracture just when unity mattered most. Children noticed everything. They noticed adults whispering. They noticed locked doors. They noticed food disappearing faster. Late winter taught children fear in ways no lesson ever could. Many carried those memories for life, shaping how they hoarded food, feared cold, and distrusted abundance even years later. Then there was the weather itself. Late winter often brought freeze-thaw cycles. Snow melted slightly, then froze again, turning paths into ice traps. Travel became more dangerous, not less. People slipped, broke bones, and died from injuries that would have been minor in summer. A broken leg in late winter was often a death sentence. And the psychological cruelty didn't stop there. Birds began to return. Light increased. The world looked like it was recovering, but food didn't grow yet. Fields were still dead. Livestock were weak. Spring teased survival without delivering it. This is why medieval people feared late winter more than early winter. Early winter tested preparation. Late winter tested endurance. It asked one brutal question: how long can you survive after everything useful is already gone? For many, the answer was not long enough. Those who made it through late winter didn't celebrate immediately. They didn't trust the warmth. They waited because they knew winter's final cruelty was hope offered too early. And yet some survived, thin, scarred, changed, because winter finally began to loosen its grip. You'd think this would be the happy part. The snow melts, the light lasts longer, the cold loosens its grip. But here's the truth that almost never gets talked about. For medieval villagers, the arrival of spring didn't immediately feel like relief. In many ways, it felt confusing, unsettling, even frightening. After months of darkness, hunger, and fear, the world didn't snap back to normal. It crept slowly, and people who had survived winter weren't the same people who entered it. The first signs of spring were subtle. A slightly warmer wind, snow softening instead of cracking, longer mornings. These changes should have meant hope, but hope had become dangerous by late winter. Villagers had learned not to trust it. Too many times, warmth had come briefly, only to be followed by another deadly freeze. People waited for spring the way you wait for someone who has betrayed you. Before, carefully, quietly. Here's a shocking fact. Late frosts killed more medieval crops than early winter storms. Just when people thought survival was secured, a sudden freeze could destroy early plantings and push famine into the coming year. Spring wasn't salvation. It was another gamble. Bodies emerging from winter were fragile. People were thinner than they had ever been. Muscles had weakened. Illness lingered. Many who survived the cold died in early spring because their bodies simply couldn't handle the sudden increase in labor. Fields needed clearing. Plowing had to begin. Animals required care. Survival demanded movement again. And exhausted bodies collapsed under the pressure. Medieval records describe people dying while planting crops, falling in the fields, never standing up again. They had survived the worst. Winter nights only to be killed by the effort of rebuilding life afterward. Survival wasn't a finish line. It was a transition. Emotionally, spring was complicated. Villagers noticed who was missing. Empty houses, silent hearths, tools that belonged to people who wouldn't return. Winter's losses became impossible to ignore once people stepped outside again. Grief that had been delayed by survival needs finally arrived. Spring didn't erase death. It revealed it. Children felt this sharply. Friends they played with the previous autumn were gone. Some asked questions, others didn't. Medieval childhood was marked by an early understanding that survival was temporary and fragile. Spring taught children that survival came with absence. And then there was guilt. Survivor's guilt long before we had a name for it. People wondered why they lived while others didn't, why their house stayed warm enough, why their food lasted longer. Medieval religious texts are full of spring confessions. Prayers asking forgiveness not for sins, but for survival itself. Here's something deeply unsettling. In some communities, spring brought accusations instead of celebration. If one family survived particularly well while others suffered, suspicion followed, hoarding favor from God, dark influence. Winter grudges didn't melt easily. Sometimes they hardened. Spring also exposed the damage winter had done to the land. Fields were exhausted, livestock weakened, tools broken, seeds eaten. Even after surviving, villagers faced months of vulnerability. One bad planting season after a harsh winter could doom an entire community. Survival was temporary until the harvest proved otherwise. Despite this, rituals emerged. Not wild celebrations, but cautious acknowledgments. Bells rang. Prayers were spoken. Fires burned longer. Light was allowed indoors again. Spring was welcomed respectfully, not joyfully, because medieval people knew how quickly seasons turned against them. One of the most haunting aspects of spring survival is this. People remembered winter long after it ended. Scarcity changed habits permanently. Survivors hoarded food even in abundance. They feared darkness more deeply. They prepared earlier. Winter left psychological fingerprints that lasted a lifetime. And yet, spring still mattered. It meant the world hadn't ended. It meant survival was possible, even if temporary. It meant children could grow. Fields could be worked. Life could continue. But victory? No. Medieval villagers didn't feel victorious. They felt cautious, because deep down everyone knew one thing. Winter always comes back. Let's end this by stepping back for a moment, because medieval winter didn't just shape villages, houses, or survival strategies. It shaped people, and in ways we rarely realize, it still shapes us. If you survived winter in a medieval village, you didn't come out stronger in the heroic sense. You came out changed, permanently winter, rewired how people thought about safety, abundance, darkness, and even happiness. And those changes didn't disappear when the snow melted. They were carried forward generation after generation. Here's something deeply unsettling but fascinating. Many behaviors we still recognize today: hoarding food, fearing empty shelves, feeling anxious in darkness, over-preparing for cold seasons, can be traced directly to centuries of winter trauma. Medieval winter wasn't a single event. It was a repeated psychological wound. Every year, it reminded people how thin the line between life and death really was. People who survived harsh winters became obsessed with preparation, not casually prepared, compulsively prepared. They stored more than they needed. They repaired earlier than necessary. They feared wasting anything. Breadcrumbs mattered. Ashes mattered. Nothing was truly useless, because winter had taught them that extra could mean survival later. Shocking fact, medieval laws about waste, food storage, and communal resources often became stricter after periods of extreme winter famine. Winter literally reshaped legal systems. Survival trauma turned into rules. Winter also changed how people understood comfort. Comfort wasn't softness. It wasn't warmth everywhere. It wasn't ease. Comfort meant enough food to last the night, enough heat to wake up alive, enough light to see the faces of the people you loved. Anything beyond that felt excessive and sometimes suspicious. This is why medieval culture often viewed luxury with discomfort. Abundance made people uneasy. Too much food, too much warmth, too much pleasure felt like tempting fate. Winter had taught them that the world corrected excess violently. Darkness, too, never fully lost its meaning. Even after winter ended, night remained symbolic of danger, uncertainty, and moral testing. Medieval stories didn't fear monsters because monsters were entertaining. They feared them because darkness had already proven it could kill without warning. Fear wasn't imaginary, it was learned. And then there's resilience. We love to romanticize medieval resilience as toughness or bravery. But real resilience back then was quieter. It was endurance without hope. It was continuing daily routines when motivation was gone. It was feeding a fire even when you didn't believe it would save you. It was getting up because lying still felt worse. Shocking fact, medieval texts rarely praise winter survival as heroic. Instead, they describe it as burdensome, humbling, and exhausting. Survival wasn't celebrated. It was endured. Winter also reshaped faith. Belief systems grew deeper not because people were naive, but because randomness was unbearable. When winter killed without logic, faith offered structure. Meaning didn't make survival easier, but it made it survivable. This is why medieval winters are so closely tied to religious calendars, rituals, and fasting periods. Faith filled the emotional gaps that winter created. Even community itself changed. Medieval villages didn't value togetherness because it was pleasant. They valued it because isolation killed. Winter proved that survival was collective. You needed shared labor, shared warmth, shared vigilance. And yet, winter also showed how fragile community was under pressure. That contradiction needing people while fearing them never fully went away. Here's the final, uncomfortable truth. Medieval winter stripped humanity down to its essentials: fear, hope, endurance, love under pressure, morality under scarcity. It showed people who they were when comfort vanished. And maybe that's why it still fascinates us. When we imagine medieval villages under snow, something in us recognizes it. The silence, the glow of one warm window, the feeling of being small against something vast and indifferent. Winter reminds us that technology softened life, but it didn't change human nature. We still fear scarcity. We still prepare for the worst. We still find comfort in light against darkness. Those instincts weren't invented by modern life. They were carved into us by centuries of winters that offered no mercy. So when you think about winter now, when you complain about cold, darkness, or inconvenience, remember this: there was a time when winter didn't inconvenience people. It tested whether they would exist at all, and the fact that we're here talking about it means they endured it long enough for us to forget how close it once was. That's the legacy of winter in a medieval village. Not beauty, not nostalgia, but survival passed quietly from one generation to the next. You know what's wild? None of this misery was rare. It wasn't a bad year, or a cursed village, or a single unlucky family. This was just normal life: cold mornings, empty bowls, bodies that ached before the sun even came up, and somehow people still woke up and did it all over again. So when we talk about medieval life, it's easy to focus on castles, kings, and battles. But the real story was survival. Quiet, exhausting, everyday survival. No applause, no reward, just making it through one more day without freezing, starving, or getting sick. And honestly, it kind of changes how you look at the past. Not as some distant, romantic era, but as real people, stuck in a system that didn't care if they were tired, hungry, or broken. If this made you see the Middle Ages differently, stick around. Because this channel isn't about glorifying history. It's about exposing what life was actually like, when survival was the only goal that mattered. I'll see you in the next one.